Good evening. I'm Gretchen Sable, and I'm president of League of Women Voters, ABC, Anoka, Blaine, Coon Rapids area, serving all of Anoka County with voter services and educational programs and all the wonderful things that League brings to you. We have two speakers tonight, well, one speaker, Rosemary Heilemann, she's from the Chicago area. She's actually with LWV Deerfield and a whole bunch of other places, and she'll tell us. And she's going to be talking about why we should abolish the Electoral College. And then I'm going to kind of chime in a little bit when we're talking about national popular vote and things like that. So I'll just let Rosemary take it away here. And we will, I had said we were going to send this to Facebook, but apparently that's not an option with this account that we have. So I'm just recording it to the cloud and we will post it on our website. Thank you.
Okay, well,
take it away.
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you for having us this evening. We're really delighted to be coming to you in another state. I'd like to introduce Michelle Thorne, who is also a member of our committee. And Michelle has been an attorney for 30 years and working in the offices of the American National Dental Association and the National United Methodist Church. And she's been an active member of the League of Women Voters of Wilmette, particularly responsible for that league's Equal Rights Amendment advocacy. So we've both been in League doing a lot of other things. I know Gretchen from some of our water work. But today we're bringing you the presentation that a committee of members from all over Illinois had input into. And it's a scripted presentation because the idea was we wanted people all over to be able to go to the League of Women Voters of Illinois website and take the materials and go ahead and use them. And there are other supplemental materials on the website as well as the presentation and the script. So I always go right straight from the script. I might throw in a couple of side comments here and there. And then at the end, we'll take questions and Michelle will read the questions from the chat box. So if you have any, you can put them in the chat box, although I have a feeling that we might cover a lot of your questions anyway. So here we go. And let me do a slideshow and start from the start. Okay. And there's a list of our different leagues that have participated in our committee all this for 3 years now. So, oops, let's see. Oh, why aren't we moving? Oh, here we go. Let's try this. There we go. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League is a natural home for the movement to abolish the Electoral College because the League is about making democracy work better for everyone. The League is specifically and proudly nonpartisan, which means that it can work to improve our democracy without partisan rancor and can help unite people around a common purpose. It has national reach and a trusted voice, as well as over 500 local leagues across the nation that are comprised of citizens like us, working to improve our democracy. The League of Women Voters recommends many changes to our election system that would increase fair and representative participation in our democracy, from issues such as voter information and registration to candidate selection and election procedures. Today, we'll talk about how the Electoral College damages our democracy and how the League is working to abolish it in favor of a direct popular vote for electing the president and vice president. They adopted this position in 1970 and most recently updated it in 2010. First, let's talk about where the Electoral College comes from. Why did the framers of the Constitution create the Electoral College? This is a discussion which could and has taken up several book chapters. I'll try to distill it down to its essential elements as understood by scholars who have tried to answer this question. The framers' most important consideration was that they wanted to limit the potential for corruption and concentration of power and to maintain independence between the executive and legislative branches. Therefore, they wanted a method other than having Congress select the president, which was the method originally suggested by the delegates. So why not just elect the president directly by the people? Some of the Constitution's framers worried that long distances and lack of communication would make the people ill-informed about the candidates and unlikely to choose the best person. They worried the people could be easily misled by a few designing men or would simply vote for the candidate from their own state. They wanted some sort of intermediary system. It's worth noting that very few of the framers worried about angry mobs hijacking the selection of the president. The worries were more about how a vast population spread over a large country would be able to make an informed choice. There was some element of the ongoing tension between northern and southern states as well. Slaveholding states did not want direct election because they wanted their enslaved people to count as 3/5 of a person in determining the number of electors the state received. Remember that this was the arithmetic used to determine their numbers in the House of Representatives. So having the elector system artificially boosted the voting representation of slaveholding states, just as it did in Congress. Whereas a direct popular vote would only count the number of people who could vote, which of course did not include enslaved persons. In fact, evidence suggests that there was a lot of discussion, confusion, and changing of minds during the process of figuring out the election system. It was one of the last issues discussed at the exhausting, long, hot, contentious convention, and fatigue and impatience may well have played a role in its adoption. It had broad but unenthusiastic support and seemed like the best they could do at the time. The second choice of many, but the first choice of few, with little idea how it would play out in reality. One historian has called it a jerry-rigged improvisation. Most of the framers did intend for the selection of the president to be based on the popular wishes of the citizenry, with the elector system as an intermediary system intended to breach the difficulties of distance and communication. James Madison considered the elector system to be the next best thing to direct selection, saying that the president is indirectly derived from the choice of the people. However, there is some evidence that they also expected the electors to exercise their own discretion in the selection of the president as a bulwark against corruption, bias, or misinformation. But the electors have almost always acted as a rubber stamp on the votes of the people, with very few exceptions. In those instances where an elector has voted differently than the state voters dictated, they have generally met with a great deal of protest and anger, which is to say, the people expect the electors to be a rubber stamp on the will of the people and have never been interested in them exercising their own discretion. Notice that none of the founders' original concerns remain relevant today. Citizens are quite able to become informed about the candidates no matter where they live. The framers' concern about the corruption and concentration of power that would come if Congress selected the president, well, that's still valid, but no one is proposing that we go to Congress picking the president. And any notion that we might need electors to exercise their own discretion to overturn a so-called poor decision by the people has just not been borne out over time. The people don't want this, and the electors have rarely done it. So in looking at how the Electoral College came about, it's clear that this is not a foundational text of our Constitution that should not or cannot be changed. It is an imperfect system that tried to address concerns of the framers at the time. Just as we have changed our system of electing the vice president and the senators, we can also change our system of electing the president if we think it's necessary to improve our democracy. And there is ample evidence that this system is directly damaging to our democracy and does in fact need to be changed. Why does the League of Women Voters take the position to abolish the Electoral College? It's really very simple. It comes down to the concept of one person, one vote. The unintended result of the Electoral College is to put the choice of president and vice president in the hands of voters in only a few so-called battleground states or swing states. I don't have to tell you the names of these states because we are all very, very familiar with them. They are 4 of our well-known swing states, and they are among the 19 states that received all campaign visits from the 2 presidential candidates in 2008. The other 31 states received not a single presidential campaign visit. Now, it was a little different this year. We didn't really have Iowa in the mix so much, but this is another unpredictable part of the Electoral College, is the swing states change from election to election, but there are a few that are often in the mix. Well, you might ask, so what if the candidates don't get to every state? In the age of television and smartphones, we can easily watch the candidates' speeches no matter where they make them. And we can get the highlights from any of a number of news outlets. True, but the problems with this system go well beyond our ability to hear what the candidates have to say. Part of the League's core mission is to encourage the informed and active participation of citizens in government. As such, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Electoral College system is that it creates a disincentive to vote for citizens living in non-battleground states, which is the majority of people in our country. If you live in Illinois or Mississippi, why should you bother going out on a cold or rainy day to vote when you know your state is going to go blue or red anyway? And this, I'll take a sideline on this one. Illinois in recent years has mostly gone blue. And so if you're a Republican in Illinois or you support a third-party candidate, at least in the way it's been going recently, why would you bother to go out and vote? Because all of Illinois' electors will most likely go to the blue candidate. And in fact, if you're a supporter of the blue candidate, why should you go out? Because it'll probably go blue without you. So it's really impressive that we had such big turnouts this year, which we want to take credit for. And of course, those big turnouts are helpful for all the down ballot elections, of which we had a lot of contested elections in Illinois. But people understand this this drawback, and I think it breeds cynicism about the whole electoral process, especially among the young. The data from 2016 bear this out. In this graph, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in non-swing states compared to the swing states. The Electoral College decreases participation in our democracy, and that is bad for democracy. And this focus on swing states carries over into policy. For example, a study of trade policy found that industries employing large numbers of voters in swing states were more likely to receive trade-related protection from the federal government compared to industries concentrated in non-swing states. One can ask what other policy decisions might be influenced by whether the affected states are or are not swing states. Think about climate change, for example. Another significant negative effect of the Electoral College system is that it polarizes our electorate and exaggerates our sense of being a divided nation, a nation of red versus blue. Did you know that in Alabama, in 2016, 35% of voters chose Hillary Clinton, or that 32% of California voters chose Donald Trump? That is a lot of people, not a fringe minority, but a significant portion of the populations of these states. And these are two solidly red or blue states. What about Colorado, where 43% of voters went for Trump? Or Georgia, where 46% went for Clinton? Doesn't matter. There are no centrists. There's no complicated middle ground. There's no reason to even talk to people in those other states because they are just too different from me. Their views are too extreme. This map, with which we've all become so familiar, is extremely damaging to our national unity and our ability to see the great variety of public opinions that exist everywhere and that deserve to be heard. Indeed, they need to be heard, as diverse opinions are as critical to democracy as the vote itself. And I see someone's trying to get in there, Gretchen. Do you see that number there?
I just let somebody in.
Okay, good. Without the Electoral College, we wouldn't have to see our election results through this distorted lens. What if the election results look like this? Two numbers, both very large, even in the most lopsided of victories. Okay. Remember Reagan versus Mondale in 1984? You may remember it as the most lopsided Electoral College victory in modern history, which it was. But you probably don't remember that more than 37 million people voted for Mondale, 41% of voters. This is not a trivial number, and it highlights the way the Electoral College simply erases the diversity of opinion in our democracy. And I'm so glad I'm giving this in Minnesota. I've been waiting, because when you see it through the Electoral College, almost all of those so-called blue votes are utterly forgotten, erased. Where did all of those Mondale voters go? Did all 37 million of them go to Minnesota? No, they're just gone. They don't exist. All we see is 525 to 13, the Electoral College outcome. If we began to see election results like this, might we begin to see ourselves as part of a unified democracy, choosing our leader together, no matter where we live? Might we become more open to diverse, complicated opinions among our neighbors and fellow citizens, more willing to live among people who disagree with us? Imagine if, instead of seeing ourselves as red or blue, we simply saw ourselves as Americans. The results in two recent elections point us, of course, to another serious problem with the Electoral College, which is that it can lead to a presidential winner who did not receive a majority of the votes. This has happened 5 times in our history, and it's the main reason why most people find the Electoral College troubling. You may have heard somebody say, yes, yes, all this is true, but here's why the Electoral College still makes sense. We'd like to walk through the most common myths and misperceptions about what the Electoral College does and does not accomplish, what it was meant to do, and how it's impacting our democracy. These are not just fringe theories, by the way. These are the main points that supporters of the Electoral College use to defend this antiquated system, and none of them stands up under scrutiny. Myth number 1. Without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California, New York, and Texas. Let's run through the numbers to see how it would actually play out in an election if we had it by popular vote. Let's say, for the sake of this example, that every state in the Union, all 50 states, voted 60% to 40% for the same candidate, an absolute landslide, an unbelievably strong preference for one candidate. Let's see how many states it would take to get us up to 50% if we elected the president by the national popular vote total, going in order from the largest state to the smallest. So California has the most voters, and 60% of its voters would represent 7% of the national total. Next is Texas, so we'll add it to the total. Remember, in this example, we have 60% of voters choosing the same candidate in every state. So we're seeing how long it would take for that candidate to get up to 50% of the votes. Now we add Florida, here's New York, now we add Pennsylvania, now Illinois, and we're not even halfway there. In fact, it would take the votes of 27 states to get us up to 50%, even in this incredibly lopsided scenario. In reality, of course, California and Texas might go for different candidates, in essence, canceling each other out. And margins of victory would likely be much smaller in many of these states, which means it would take even more states' votes to get us to 51%. And you can do the same exercise for cities, by the way. The 10 largest cities in the country only make up about 10% of the vote. If the largest 100 cities all voted unanimously for the same candidate, it would still only get us to 30% of the vote total, nowhere near 50%. And this top 100 list includes cities like Laredo, Texas, and Spokane, Washington. These are cities with populations in the 200,000s. So that was a theoretical answer to the myth that a few large states would be enough to win the popular vote. Now let's look at actual election results. Here's the 2012 election results by state for Barack Obama. Starting again with the largest state over on the left, you see California there on the bottom, and the smallest one there. Starting with California and adding the vote totals for each state. And you can see that it took votes from 39 states to get him to 63 million votes, which would have been needed if we had had the popular vote. That's a large majority of states. It is simply mathematically impossible for the election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states or the largest cities. The fact is that direct election by popular vote would ensure that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. Voters from swing states would count just the same as voters from non-swing states. Voters from the city would count just the same as voters from the country. A California Republican's vote would count just the same as a California Democrat's. Let's look specifically at California, where the presidential vote is split just as it is in all states. 32% of California voters went for Donald Trump in 2016. Once the state's votes were totaled, all 4.5 million of those Trump votes were erased. Why should only a portion of a state's votes count in choosing the president of all the people? In a national popular vote system, those votes would be added to the national total along with the votes from all other states, regardless of who got the most in each state, and regardless of whether that state is big or small. The fact is that we would no longer be voting by state, but by person. So a California voter would get no more say in our presidential election than a voter from Mississippi, Rhode Island, Kansas, or any other state. This is what the framers intended when they unanimously agreed with James Madison's statement that the president is to act for the people, not for the states. Myth number 2. Smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. The fact is that there is no coherent small state or large state interest that needs protecting by the Electoral College. Even the smallest state has substantial diversity within it, and it is a fallacy to suggest that when a state goes red or blue, that this represents the interests of the entire state. The concerns of a farmer are likely to be very different than those of a computer programmer, whether they live in New Hampshire, Nebraska, or any other small state. Small states represent a great diversity of economic interests, and they share many of those interests with large states. For example, agriculture. Most farmers actually live in states with large populations, such as Texas, Florida, California, and Illinois. And they share economic interests with farmers from smaller states all over the country. The great political battles of American history have been fought between opposing ideologies or economic interests, not between large states and small states. There is no coherent small state interest that needs protecting by the Electoral College. The representatives of small states do not vote as a bloc in Congress, and their citizens do not vote as a bloc for president. The numbers from the 2016 election show this emphatically. The smallest 1/3 of states, those with fewer than 6 electoral votes, did not all go for the same candidate. In fact, they were exactly evenly split, with 8 going for Clinton and 8 going for Trump. Small states do not vote as a bloc, and they do not benefit from the Electoral College. In fact, smaller states are routinely ignored by presidential candidates under the current system, both as candidates and as presidents. And as I mentioned earlier, swing states are the ones that receive the vast majority of attention from candidates, and swing state interests are more heavily reflected in our laws and policies than are the interests of small states, large states, red states, or blue states, especially in election years. So there is no basis for the myth that smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure their interests are represented by the president. And in fact, the Electoral College actually diminishes the rightful representation of the residents of larger states. For example, Virginia's population is almost 9 times larger than Delaware's. Now I hope you have good visual memory for images. So here you see Virginia's size and Delaware's size now. But it gets only about 4 times as many electors because electors are based on the number of senators and representatives from each state. Is this fair? Myth number 3. The Electoral College protects the rights of the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Protecting minority rights is a critical part of democratic societies, and the founding fathers designed our government accordingly. As a result, 2 of our 3 branches of government are designed to ensure the protection of minority rights. The first is the courts. Their role is to ensure the constitutional rights of the individual, regardless of the opinion of the majority of the citizens. Oh, let's see, there we go. The second is the Senate, in which every state, regardless of population size, gets 2 representatives. This ensures that Wyoming gets heard just as loudly as New York, even though more people live in New York. We do not protect a minority by giving them outsized political power. We protect the rights of minority groups and individuals through our Constitution's Bill of Rights, our courts, and our laws. Our votes should all count equally. The president is supposed to represent the interests of all Americans as fairly and equally as possible. This means 1 person, 1 vote. Myth number 4. Abolishing the Electoral College will mostly benefit Democratic candidates. First of all, modern analysis shows that in 1960, Republican Richard Nixon actually won the popular vote by about 48,000 votes over Democrat John Kennedy. Let's see, is that the one I want? Okay. This is the Electoral College map for the 2004 election, where George Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more votes. So this one here is the actual map. But if John Kerry had received only 60,000 more votes in Ohio, watch what would have happened. Oops, I did that wrong. There. he would have won the Electoral College and thus the election. I must have done the other one. Let's see, that's the right one. And this is, okay, so if Kerry had won Ohio, he would have won the election, even though Bush still was 3 million votes ahead. And on a more personal level, what about the Republican voter in so-called blue Vermont, or the Democrat voter in so-called red Kansas? Neither of these voters feels that their vote for president counts. This is a disincentive for them to vote, and this is bad for democracy. The system can and has affected both parties. This is a nonpartisan issue. And just as a sideline, when the League adopted this position in 1970, that was right after the 1968 election when George Wallace almost disrupted Richard Nixon's electoral vote. And he was hoping to gain some concessions from Nixon and then, throw his votes to Nixon. But Wallace wasn't quite that successful. So after that time, there was an amendment to the Constitution, a resolution brought by Birch Bayh, and it made it through the House of Representatives with strong bipartisan support. Nixon was in favor of it, but when it got to the Senate, there was a group of Southern senators that were able to block it. And so that's what happened in 1970. And that's the time when this position was adopted by the League of Women Voters. So historically, it has had bipartisan support because people realize it can affect either party. So how do we abolish the Electoral College? The League of Women Voters supports a constitutional amendment that would replace the Electoral College with direct election of the president. And I'll talk about the compact also, but right here we're talking about an amendment. In theory, it's quite simple. Congress passes a resolution for an amendment by 2/3 majority in both houses, and then 3/4 of the states, 38, have to ratify it. Now, getting to a constitutional amendment will nevertheless take time. It's not going to happen this year. The League of Women Voters is currently focusing on what we're doing today, which is starting discussions about where the Electoral College comes from and how it's bad for our democracy. And perhaps more importantly, we want people to understand that passing a constitutional amendment is possible and can happen. Most of us probably think that ratifying new amendments is a thing of the past, something for a bygone era of political unity, a quaint anachronism. Here's a timeline showing the dates that all amendments after the Bill of Rights were ratified. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clumps, then another gap of 43. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and 50s and 60s. Then a gap of 21 years until our most recent amendment was passed in 1992. What distinguishes these periods of constitutional activity? They tended to be periods of great national political activity, where the citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis, where the demand for a change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the progressive era of the turn of the last century, and the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s. We are in the middle of another period of political activity, of demand for change. Only time will tell, but the level of activity we are seeing now and the genuine concerns about the resilience of our democracy are remarkable. In fact, we may be on the verge of adding a 28th Amendment to the Constitution. The Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress in 1972, and as of 2 years ago, needed only 3 more states to ratify it in order to become part of our Constitution. In 2017, Nevada ratified it. In 2018, Illinois, I will add, finally ratified it. I'm so sorry, everybody, for that one. In January 2020, Virginia ratified it. The ERA is now awaiting a ruling on a deadline Congress placed on it in 1972 before it becomes a part of our Constitution. Amending the Constitution is not a thing of the past. It is a thing of right now. There is a process for doing so, and that process requires the citizenry to make it known to our legislators that we want change. We do that all the time with legislation. It's the same for amendments. We just have to build a stronger consensus and a louder voice. It is, as always, one step at a time. Because of the long time frame expected for an amendment to pass and be ratified, the League also supports an interim measure that would effectively nullify the Electoral College and result in the election of the president by the popular vote while we work on a long-term constitutional amendment. This measure is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and it would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia combined. It pledges a state's electoral votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, and it would not take effect until enacted by states possessing a majority of the electoral votes, 270 votes. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has been enacted into law in 16 states with 196 electoral votes. The compact would take effect when enacted by states with 74 more electoral votes. So it's not the number of states, but the number of electoral votes. This is a nonpartisan proposal that has been passed by strong majorities in both Republican-controlled and Democratic-controlled state houses and Senate. And so this is what Gretchen and I were talking about earlier. Illinois passed this compact back in 2008, and the League was not involved with that. So Illinois has been a part of this compact for many years. And so when our committee got started, there was no point in us even talking about this. And so we got started working on an amendment. In the League, however, there are people that are very strongly working on the compact. They say the amendment would take too long and that this has better chance. And so it's two ways to get to the same result, with the advantage to the amendment that it's permanent, but the disadvantage to the amendment is that it's a long process. And so those are our two, within the League, but they're both in the position. The compact is in the position as the League recognizes it as an alternative, an acceptable alternative until the Electoral College can be abolished. So that's the story there. One reform which the League specifically rejects is the voting by electors based on proportional representation in lieu of the present winner-take-all system. The Constitution says that states are free to assign their electors however they see fit, and winner-take-all is not the only option. Currently, Maine and Nebraska assign their electors proportionate to each candidate's percentage in the state. But actually, this little description, the way they do it, at least in Maine for sure, they have the two districts. So each district is a winner-take-all district, and then there's two at large. And I think Nebraska does it that way too. So it's not exactly proportional by all the numbers. It's just broken down into districts. So if you really did have a truly proportional system, the problem is that it's fairly likely that no candidate would receive the 270 electoral vote majority needed to win. This, according to the Constitution, would send the election of the president to the House of Representatives, where each state, regardless of population, would receive only one vote. Now, let me emphasize that for you. So if an election goes into the House because no one candidate has a majority, 270 votes, the entire delegation of New York, one vote. The entire delegation of California, one vote. That guy in Wyoming, one vote. Let's see. This would further remove the election of the president from the will of the people and would be in direct contrast to the intent of the framers of the Constitution. You're probably scratching your head trying to figure out why this system would make it unlikely that a candidate would receive 270 electoral votes. The reason is that we always have more than just two parties running for president. There are third parties, fourth parties, and beyond. In the 2016 election, votes were actually cast for 31 different candidates, plus a none of the above in a few states. Let's run through a quick example with the 1968 election, a closely fought contest between Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace, who was an unusually strong third-party candidate. Here you can see that Nixon won the popular vote by a thin margin, but easily received the required 270 Electoral College votes under the winner-take-all system. What if the electoral votes were allocated based on the percentage of popular vote by state? In Kansas, Nixon would have received 4 electoral votes instead of all 7. In Illinois, Nixon would have received 12 instead of 26. In Florida, 6 of 14. As you can see, Wallace and Humphrey are picking off votes bit by bit in each state. When you do this for all 50 states, the results of proportional allocation is that there is no winner in the Electoral College. Nixon fails to achieve the required 270 votes. See, he only gets 235. So the election of the president would have been turned over to the House of Representatives with 1 vote per state and none, by the way, for DC. The simplest, most permanent solution is to elect the president by direct vote by all citizens of the United States. 1 person, 1 vote. Abolishing the Electoral College would be a common sense solution to update a system that most Americans agree is utterly out of date, confusing, and downright silly. It's time to start building the momentum that will once and for all abolish this dysfunctional system of electing our president. This may seem like a daunting task, but remember that we've amended the Constitution to change the way we elect senators, to impose term limits on the presidency, to include Washington, D.C. in the election of the president, to eliminate the poll tax, and to change the voting age to 18. All amendments that affect the way we elect our representatives in Washington. There's no reason we cannot abolish the Electoral College if we decide to do it. So let's get to work. There you go. So that's a presentation any of you can give because it's all in the script.
Thanks, Rosemary. So I heard Michelle's going to be asking the questions. Is that correct, that are in the chat right now?
If that's all right with you.
Yeah, are there any? I hadn't seen any come through yet. No.
I haven't seen any in the chat.
Anybody have questions?
Well, I do. So if we went to a national popular vote, then I would assume that there would have to be national rules for elections, and that they wouldn't be state by state like we are now.
True. There would have to be supportive legislation. Yes.
And, you know, we like our way that we vote here.
Well, and all the states do. So yes, that would be one of the consequences. Well, except, you know, if you think about it, if you're just looking at the numbers, I mean, as long as the age, you know, if it's all age, you know, everyone, no one can say, well, we'll let 16-year-olds vote, you know, like they might. But if the age is the same, if you're just looking for number totals, you're just asking for numbers. That really does not need to, what kind, you know, it doesn't really change exactly, doesn't have to.
For example, in Minnesota, if you're a felon, you can't vote until you've completed your probation. Other states allow felons to vote when they're out of prison.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know how they would resolve that, if they would have to, because those are such detailed.
Well, it's not going to matter in the big number. There's not that many people in that group, but
because the league, that position I sent you, you'll see that the league's position also is in favor of uniform election laws throughout the country. Now, whether they would be able to attend as such, to details such as that in enacting supportive legislation, I don't really know. But the numbers, even if the states don't have exactly the same rules like that, if you're still looking just for the popular vote, I think we can still get there. But yeah, nothing is easy. There would always be questions.
Yeah, there's questions coming in the chat now. Oh, Michelle's answering the questions in the chat.
No, Michelle, you asked me the questions.
Okay, I apologize. So the question is, what states are part of the compact? And I just put a link to it.
Did you send them to the Wikipedia article?
I sent them to the nationalpopularvote.com.
Yeah. The Wikipedia article is good because someone is updating it. Colorado recently, they had passed it in Colorado, but then there was a referendum movement to remove it, and then that move to remove it lost. So Colorado is now on it. And what's the next question, Michelle?
Let's see. So and it's from Karen again. So Minnesota has not, and this is something we could lobby for, Karen says.
Has not joined the compact or joined?
Yeah, that's correct.
Compact. Yeah, absolutely. It's up to you and your state league members where you want to put your energies. And if so lobbying for the compact would mean you're contacting your state legislators to join the compact. At this point, working for an amendment, the first step is your congressman in Washington. So you would be lobbying your congressmen and senators first, and then after that, you're still going to have to go back to your state representatives when it gets, let's be positive, when it gets to the ratification stage. So, if they get the message now talking about the compact and then an amendment goes through and they get the message again, the reasons for both approaches are exactly the same. It's just, how are you going to accomplish it?
I want to add some information from Minnesota here. There was an article in the Tribune last week. The Star Tribune is our Minneapolis paper. And they were of the opinion that since we have split legislature, the Senate is Republican and the House is Democrat, that we would not see an NPV compact vote even come up this year to get to the governor's desk. And so that was their thought on that. And then I talked to Nick Harper, who is the state, he works for the state league, and he's voter service and some other things, advocacy staff guy. And he said that anything relating to Electoral College isn't a priority for Minnesota this year. And so they're not going to be doing any work on it. So it would be, if we chose to do it, we would be kind of on our own, but that's not to say we shouldn't do it. I think it's, that was what I put in the title of this email, that we're going to talk about this now, or should we just wait another 4 years and talk about it again? And
well, and I'll tell you, here's what we say. What's important is to keep this conversation going, because exactly what you're saying happens. Once the elections are over, people completely forget about it and they don't talk about it, and it's just out of their minds until the next election comes up. So what we really would like, whether you're, whichever, if you're promoting the compact, if you're promoting the amendment, or both of them, just to keep the conversation going. So at one of my early presentations, my friend Carol was in the audience, and she invited her sister-in-law, Diane. And so I was making a big deal, just keep talking to people, bring it up in conversation. What have you been doing? Oh, I went to this great talk about the Electoral College, blah, blah, blah. So Carol told me that they had Christmas dinner, and the whole family, this was before COVID, of course. And so the whole family was around the dinner table, and there was a lull in the conversation. And all of a sudden, Diane pipes up, so what about that Electoral College? So, but that's the thing to do, is to just keep people talking about it. Even if they disagree, you know, engaging in a conversation keeps it in the forefront as a topic that needs to be addressed. And some of these questions, like your question about the uniformity of the election laws, sure, yeah, those are problems. Those would be problems. It wouldn't be just a smooth sail. Michelle.
Can I jump in, and then I'll get the chat, but Rosemary is the Electoral College expert here, so I'm
But I talk
just
a lot.
I'm learning from her. But and I know we talked, it was Sandy, I think, I don't know if she's still, oh, there she is. We talked about women's suffrage. So, you know, with women's suffrage, there were on, you know, contemporaneous parallel tracks, right? And that's, I mean, that's my view. I'm not, I haven't worked with this as much as Rosemary. I've been working more on ERA and that sort of thing. But, you know, you had changing the state votes for women, and then you had the constitutional amendment. And that's my perspective on this. The popular vote compact, I think, is a great idea. And I think it's, you know, it's similarly, this goal is similar to the Electoral College, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. It's an agreement among the states. States can get out of it. It's something the legislators, I mean, yeah, Mel, maybe you can jump in as an elector. You know, it's something states can get out of. I mean, it's not a bad patch, I think. So, you know, my perspective is, sure, go ahead and change it in Minnesota while you can. Sort of the same thing on the ERA. You know, you have ERA Min, who's very involved, and they want to get a state ERA in the Minnesota Constitution, which is a nice patch until we get the archivist to recognize the 28th Amendment, which is the ERA, because it was ratified by Virginia January 27th, 2020, and Department of Justice has been holding it up. But sorry, that's my sidelight.
It's all relevant because it's the same idea.
It's the same thing. And, you know, I mean, Rosemary can speak more articulately to why we need the constitutional amendment for the Electoral College. But, you know, my perspective is the way the Constitution's written right now, the authority is with the state legislatures. The state, that was the whole idea of, you know, Ted Cruz in Texas trying to get Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia to, you know, through their legislators to overturn this recent election, because that's how Article 2 reads when it comes to electors. You know, the power is not with the people. Power ain't with the people in the technical text of the Constitution. And until that is amended, you know, it's just, you know, hope and a prayer, and, you know, hope that people continue to mostly follow rules. But I would say spell it out. You know, the US Constitution was written in a little over 3 months. It's not perfect. Amended. Sorry, thanks, Rosemary.
That's all right. No.
Mel wanted, he was kind of nodding, and
Yeah.
I'm sorry to ignore the chat, but
No, that's okay. What do we got next?
Well, there was, you know, you give, in your presentation, you give too much credit to the framers of the Constitution. They were not interested in voting public. I mean, at the time, the only people who could vote were men that owned property. They weren't big Democrats. They weren't small d Democrats. They didn't believe in democracy. As a matter of fact, democracy is never mentioned. As a matter of fact, voting rights is never mentioned in the Constitution until the amendments. So they really did give it all to the states to decide how elections were going to be run.
Exactly.
thanks, Mel. And I mean, think about it. There are 5 amendments of the 27 that are recognized, 5 that are head-on related to voting, right? You've got direct election of senators, you've got no poll tax, you've got, you know, DC can vote. Well, that one too, you know, DC, that's another one actually, that makes 6. 18-year-olds, right? The 19th Amendment for women, and then you've got the 15th Amendment to not prohibit voting on the basis of race. And still we have obstruction. So it's, you know, let's fix it. I'm sorry, Rosemary. I'm going to get fired by Rosemary soon.
I got one question, and I think it's the toughest one for direct elections. What do you do with an election that's so close that it ends up being a recount in 170,000 precincts?
Well, you know what? That one actually, but don't forget, it's a recount for only 2 offices. It's not like they're recounting the whole ballot. So first of all, it's only that office that they're going to recount. And every state in the country has procedures for recounts. So that's already been done. They know how to do it. Every state's had experience doing recounts. So first of all, it's not an impossible, it sounds like an impossible hurdle, but if a recount is what it would take to ensure people of the correctness of the result, it's not out of this world impossible. All the states are able to do it. The second thing, of course, it leads me down a path, and this is just personal, this is not league especially, but has me started looking at ranked choice voting. And so I'm interested in that. That's all I'll say. I don't know if it would be a solution or not, but that leads me to that, idea.
I like it.
Rosemary, the next question, also from Karen, is after this election, I'm afraid that the big national voting rights issue will be voter ID. I don't know if you want.
You might be right. That's again a state by state. Not only voter ID. I was asked by my Rotary Club to give a little talk on voting, and I was like, well, what do you want me to say? Just go vote, So I went to the National League website, and I looked up some of the lawsuits that the National League actually they had signed on through the state leagues in various states on all kinds of election issues, not only voter ID, but one that stuck in my mind. Several states did have absentee voting, but one, you had to give a reason. You had to have an illness. You had to have some reason. And I copied one of them because it was so unbelievable. You had to have a notary sign off on your signature, or some of them required 2 witnesses for your signature on an absentee ballot. Oh, come on, in the middle of a pandemic, you're gonna go out to the bank, and if you have the absentee ballot in the first place and you had to provide a reason, you probably are limited in some capacity as it is. Just unbelievable requirements. And some of the suits that the league got involved with had to do with, there's a remedy. Suppose I send in a mail-in ballot, and especially I think of our kids, the teenagers, when they register for the first time, they think they're all fancy and they come up with some, creative signature that they forget about, over 10 years. And then, so you send in a ballot and you sign it your normal way, and it goes into your election authority, and then they check your signature and they match it with the one on file. So a remedy is that, there's another term, I can't remember it. If it doesn't match, then they're supposed to contact me. Hey, Heilemann, we couldn't match your signatures. Please, whatever, come into the office or send us an affidavit or whatever the remedy is so that we can count your ballot. Well, some states don't have a remedy. So somebody can look at the ballot and say, oh, it doesn't match, and throw it away. And it's just on that judge, with no oversight. So there were so many things. So voter ID is one, but let me tell you, there are so many odd rules and regulations throughout the states. And of course, not to mention, was it Texas that eliminated like 90% of their polling places? So you have these huge Texas counties and people have to travel, 100 miles or 200 miles, whatever it was, to even go vote. So yes, voter ID is a big one, but there are a lot of other really sad rules in different states. So thank you for that. Yeah.
All right, Rosemary, this is from Karen also. She says, I just read the article. That's the article that Gretchen had from the Minnesota paper.
Oh, okay.
And one of the statements was from Republican Senator, a former Secretary of State who chairs the Senate's Elections Committee, said she has concerns that the approach, this is the National Popular Vote Compact, which gets around amending the Constitution by forming an interstate compact, is legally fraught. She also worries the change would give voters in smaller states and regions less relevance. And this person, Senator Mary Kiffmeyer, is quoted, I guarantee you, when you look at the scheme of the national popular vote, it will be New York, it will be California. She said, rural Minnesota or rural Midwest states will get the shaft. And she, Karen is wondering if you'd comment on that, Rosemary.
Well, there are a lot of problems with the compact. I don't know the legal problems. As I'm not an expert in it, I will say that if you think of it as a patch, the way that Michelle has described it, then it's good for that. And it's a way the supporters of the compact feel that they have a better chance of getting a compact in place than an amendment. And so, we are bound to support both approaches. And as I say, we are really working for an amendment. And I don't know if Gretchen wants to say more about the compact.
Well, and in that case, in what Senator Kiffmeyer is saying here, it would be the same for an amendment too. I thought that the statistics that you had, Rosemary, that showed, how many states it would take to get to a decision really belies that. I think that this is kind of an example of something that we all think would be true, so we never bothered to look at the data. And when you do look at the data, you realize that it's not as you thought.
Exactly.
And so, by using something like this presentation as a basis for discussions is valuable.
I'm so glad you feel that way. And again, if you have a group you belong to, if it's AUW or even one of the political parties, and either one, because it's applicable, it's nonpartisan, it's applicable to any party or any group that you're involved with. Now with Zoom, we can come, we'd be happy to do it, but you can also do it yourself. It's scripted and ready to go. And we have a shorter version that's 20 minutes. If it's a Rotary or an Optimist or something like that meets over lunch, it's not quite as complete, but it'll serve the purpose if you want to do a shorter one. And again, we have supplemental materials as well.
Rosemary,
Yeah, go ahead,
no,
Michelle.
No, it's just going to read from the chat. Please go ahead, Gretchen.
No, I was too, since you weren't talking. So you go ahead.
Okay, so Sandra Connor says, I am developing arthritis in my right thumb. This is causing my signature to change and even vary depending on how my thumb feels on any given day. So I think that's to the, your commentary, Rosemary, on, whether you can even cure the signature issue.
Cure, that's what it is. It's cure. I said remedy. They use the
same thing.
You're right, though. That's the term they use. They use cure. So yeah, so a couple of options, not now during COVID, but at some point in the future, if you want to go to the trouble of re-registering just to get on there, you could do that. It's a problem, and that's why there should be a cure, so that people have a way to confirm that it's they.
The next comment or question is from Pat Kennedy. In Illinois, what were the circumstances in which the compact got passed? Did one party hold both houses? It appears changes weaken the role of the party. Why did the party support it?
You know what? I looked up, I tried to find articles on, it was in 2008. So the compact was just developed like in 2007. So it was shortly after the thing was proposed. And I just found, all I could find was a little article, so-and-so and so-and-so proposed the compact, blah, 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 and it passed by blah, 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 and that was it. I mean, there was no discussion, there were no articles debating it in the newspaper, there was, it was just oh yeah, this is a good idea, boom, and that was it. So Illinois, I presume there was a Democratic majority at the time, but not always. It hasn't always been a Democratic majority in Illinois. I'd have to go back and look. But that's how it was done. So that's all I can tell you.